Alright, I'm going to do a little presentation on the wonderful world of logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are rampant in a lot of political and advertising discourse, um, and oftentimes it's there and it doesn't get called out. So one of the reasons that I like to teach logical fallacies, in addition to you know it being part of the curriculum for advanced placement language and composition, I also like to teach it because it has real world application, and you see these things all the time, but um, that a lot of times it goes unnoticed or people just buy into things. So logical fallacies, seeing through the deception. That's the whole point of this presentation, being able to see through it when we see it. I teach logic every once in a while. I used to teach logic, and when I was in the advanced placement language and composition course, I used to teach. Um, there's two kinds of logic. There's cogent, and then there's fallacious. And then first type is cogent. Cogent reasoning is logically true or has a high probability of being true when we start talking about inductive and deductive reasoning. Um, so the second kind is fallacious reasoning based on a fallacy. Fallacy comes from the Latin stem, which means lie or falsehood. It also refers to arguments that cannot be proven or have not been observed. And um, I, I like to point this out that they're all over the place, and therefore it's kind of our job as critical thinkers in the 21st century to be able to sort out fallacies from reality. So here we go. Um, I do also want to point out that just because something is or is not logical, that there aren't other ways to appeal to people. Pathos is rather important, using emotions as well as ethos. But for the purpose of our presentation, we're going to focus on logical fallacies and fallacious reasoning. Here's the first set. There's the appeal to false authority, inconsistency, suppressed evidence fallacies, because there's some that fall underneath that. Either or, begging the question, questionable premise, and tokenism. So we'll talk first to the appeal to false authority. Basically, this is the appeal um, of presenting an argument based on authority that doesn't necessarily have the authority to win that argument or the amount of research, etc. The most common one is called the appeal to power. A lot of times, parents engage in this is because I said so. Um, or simply because a person or group has gained a certain position of power does not necessarily mean that their arguments are always correct. Um, you know, in political discourse, people talk about how um, I would be a great person to govern because of my success in business. Well, just because you've been successful in business doesn't mean that you're going to be successful working inside of the government. It's a different environment altogether. So, but that's an example of the appeal to power. Um, Sometimes you hear this, well, the president said so. Um, just because the president said so doesn't necessarily make that the truth. Um, so one of the things that I recommend is that you need to be able to scrutinize experts and facts and know how to research and find your way through and figure out, the biases inherent within different groups, and also to know that experts in one field are not necessarily experts in another. Um, the next one is the common man appeal. Common man appeal means that it classically referred to the ability of orators in ancient Rome and in other places to get the mob that was listening to their speech to get so angry that they would go out and riot and do all kinds of violent acts against their political opponents. Um, but now it's kind of been supplanted with the idea of, well, because a majority of the people believe that, and then you insert the policy that, then we ought to do it. Um, you know, just because a majority of people believe such and such a thing, it isn't necessarily true. But the idea that because it has popular support, somehow that's got to be the best route. Sometimes it might just be that the majority of the people are uninformed or aren't very bright about the topic, and that's why they um, are taking the stance that they are. But this common man appeals, like I'm a common man, and a majority of people are like me, etc. Next one is called testimonials. This is um, where a spokesperson speaks on behalf of a product and says, it works for me, and therefore it's going to work for you. It also kind of refers to when people are speaking outside of their areas or expertise. Even though like Kobe Bryant might wear Nike shoes, does that necessarily make Nike shoes the best shoes for you? And the Atkins diet was famous for a few years. Um, just because it worked for the people in the advertisement doesn't logically necessarily mean it's going to work for you. A lot of times, what you'll see is in very small print, it'll say results not typical. And that's the way uh, the advertising agency or the company gets out of being accused of lying or libel. Um, the next one has to do with inconsistency. The fallacy of containing two contradictory arguments in the same argument or set of actions. A good example is our current political debate about drugs and everything. And we say no to drugs, and we want a drug-free society, and yet alcohol and cigarettes are legal. We're kind of guilty of the fallacy of inconsistency in that case. We are willing to overlook our own personal biases and our own faults, but impose restrictions on people who don't do the same things that we do. So um, this is just the same thing as hypocrisy to a certain extent. Then there's a series of what are called suppressed evidence fallacies in which the whole picture isn't being brought to light, or the argument is being characterized in a way that it was never meant to be. Straw man is the first type. It means purposely misrepresenting your opponent's argument and trading it in for a weaker one while ignoring a stronger one. A good example is to call Obamacare socialism. Obamacare is not socialism. Socialism has its own rules and regulations, but they're saying it's socialism, and it's easier to attack the straw man of socialism than it is to actually attack the healthcare plan and its different parts. So that's an example of straw man, trading in the stronger opponent, which would have been, Obama's healthcare legislation, into socialism, which is a lot easier to fight against, especially with the history of the United States and the fights against communism during the Cold War, etc., that would appeal to an audience that really doesn't know its history that well. The second type is called name calling. Name calling basically means purposely associating your opponent's argument with negative things that aren't necessarily true. The previous example was to compare it to socialism, or this, not following what the president says or does as being unpatriotic. What we're saying is there's a lack of patriotism if you don't believe blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not necessarily true. The opposite of name calling then is glittering generality. That means actually presenting your own presentation with positive things that aren't necessarily provable or related. A good example is the Patriot Act. Let's name it the Patriot Act, and let's basically give the executive branch unwavering and dictatorial-like powers to detain people, etc., without even charging them with things, etc. But it's called the Patriot Act, so it must be great. I also see it like in political slogans and the like, where like this such and such a candidate is good for America, and they're for freedom and things like that, and it's like, well, so the other person is against freedom, right? In either case, the idea is they're presenting themselves with these positive images that aren't even logical and don't really work. Card stacking, then, is the deliberate suppressing of evidence or facts that would go against your own argument, while only presenting the ones that support. And the example here, prosecuting attorney presenting circumstantial evidence and then was able to suppress evidence. That's called card stacking. You basically stack the deck in your favor. The next fallacy is called either or. This is a method that is used all the time. Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly on Fox News, they are notorious for this. But what they do is they present an argument as if there's only two possible outcomes to a given situation. They'll say, well, you're either for this or you're this. You're either this or that. You know, and it's really a false dilemma, you know. And I heard this being used also when back during the George W. Bush administration. You know, they'd say, so do you support the president or are you against the troops? Well, you know, what about the third possibility that I don't agree with the president, but I support the troops and want them to come home and be safe? In either case, like, this fallacy was at work. You're either this way or you're that. And the way that you beat this is all you have to do is present a third option that's viable or, you know, can take place. Next one is called begging the question. Fox News does this a lot. And I've seen it, I've heard it in a lot of talk radio too. They'll start a debate based upon a question, and the question will include an example of something that is a questionable premise. It'll be something that isn't necessarily provable, or it'll be something that's absolutely false. But because they present it in the terms of a question, it seems, you know, like that it's less scurrilous of a point. But whenever you raise things in the form of a question, you're at least partially implying that that question is, or that questionable premise is true. So you're like, well, is the president under the control of aliens? Well, in a way, and then we have a debate. We've partially implied that that's true. So that's a logical fallacy. The next one's called tokenism. Tokenism is the idea of presenting a one-time occurrence as if it is a consistent trend. A good example of this, and they'll do this, corporations are notorious for this. They'll do one good thing out of many, many evil things that they've done in a huge list, and they'll go, oh, but we're such a benevolent and good company. And in 1998, you know, Nike stopped working with some of the factories in Indonesia because the working conditions and the situation were just terrible. But they presented themselves as being this wonderful, benevolent company at the time, when really their common practice still, instead of Indonesia, now it's China, to have what would be considered, you know, starvation wages and unworkable situations in third world countries where there's dictators so that the people don't have any rights. But the idea is, oh, look, we did this one thing, and so therefore we must be a great company. That's a perfect example of tokenism. You know, if you do evil your entire life and you do one act of good and you present the one act of good as if that's your life, that you're still evil. So then these are the last set of logical fallacies then. Here's the overview. The first one is ad hominem. Two wrongs make a right. Non sequitur, equivocation, and ambiguity. The appeal to ignorance, composition and division, slippery slope, hasty conclusion, and generalizations. So we'll start with ad hominem. Ad hominem is Latin for at the person. This is when you attack the person rather than the argument themselves. Instead of arguing the point, you know, like somebody makes an argument against me and, you know, my point of view, instead of taking on their argument, I say, well, you're a dork. What I did is I've attacked the person rather than attacked what they were about. Now, sometimes like character and credentials are relevant, but usually it's the safer bet is if you want to argue back, you need to argue against what they've actually said, and also propose what you have in mind rather than attacking them personally. So then there's another one called two wrongs make a right. These fallacies, the first one is called common practice. Just because something is done on a regular basis doesn't necessarily make it okay to do. But people will say, well, there were a whole bunch of other people talking in the classroom. You know, I see this with students. You know, well, we do this all the time. It must be okay. Or why did I get called out? That's not fair. Well, just because it's something's being done by people on a regular basis doesn't mean that that bad thing that's being done is good. Another one, traditional wisdom. Sometimes like people argue, well, um, you know, shoot, we've been doing this as part of a tradition, and so we can't break the tradition. It's got to be good. And you know, like lynching was a tradition in the South when it came to certain situations. And thing is, it even though it was a horrible and terrible act, they would be, oh, well, that's how we've always handled things, you know. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. And so a lot of people say, well, it's part of a tradition, it must be okay. It's not okay. Hazing, another tradition in certain branches of the military and in team sports and things like that sometimes, that's not, just because it's a tradition doesn't necessarily make it the right thing to do, and it's something that should be stopped altogether. Next, this the crazy part is all fallacies are non sequitur in some way, but non sequitur means does not follow. Um, they do this. Many terrorists are from Saudi Arabia. That's why we need to bomb Iraq. Nice, huge logic jump between sentence one and sentence two. Another example, I always, you know, a lot of times they're purposely like misguided. You know, there's an advertisement that's non sequitur, and it'll say, you know, Joe Donnelly, you know, voted in favor of Obamacare. He's he's bad for this country, and what's implied is that somehow that Obamacare is bad, and that's the logical step that's missing. But they're not putting it there. It's non sequitur, and it's even non sequitur too because it's questionable premises all the way around. But in either case, that's kind of like the example I think of, because there's a Senate race going on right now that shows that. Equivocation. Um, this is prominently found in the play Macbeth, you know, where they were saying one thing, but the meaning was actually something different. But basically, it's the idea of changing the meaning of a word in one or part of an argument and then using it as another meaning later in the argument. This is a great example, a sugar industry statement that says sugar is a vital part of the body and is a key ingredient in metabolic processes. Um, the sugar industry is trying to sell you sucrose. They were referring to glucose, which is created inside of the body. But they purposely use that ambiguity to convey a fallacious message. In the play Macbeth, you know, the ghosts say that no man born of woman can kill Macbeth. And so Macbeth misinterprets that as, well, I guess everybody was born of a woman, so nobody can kill me. What they weren't, what they purposely did is they used the ambiguity of born of a woman. In this case, Macduff was born via C-section. And because of that ambiguity, Macduff was ultimately the avenging hero and chops Macbeth's head off. So yeah, that's equivocation. It's like basically standing in front of the truth without actually telling it. You know, ambiguity isn't necessarily a bad thing in every case, but when it's used purposely to be fallacious and to mislead, it's equivocation. Um, the appeal to ignorance kind of refers to, well, that something is true because there's no evidence that refutes its existence. A lot of times we're talking about, you know, huge things. Like there's no other intelligent life in the universe because there's no evidence that there's intelligent life. Well, you don't, you can't reach that conclusion as an example because even without the proof of one, that doesn't mean it's not there. That means that there's a possibility that it's still there. Next one is composition. I see this a lot in advertisements. It refers to the fallacy that assuming that because a particular item has a certain property, that the entire sum of its parts will have that property. Advertisements do this. They'll be like, for only 20,000 low monthly payments of $7, you too can own blah, 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 blah. And so, like, you're thinking, oh, $7. Yeah, but when you add up $7 times the number of payments that you have to do, it's still a lot of money, but they're purposely using just that particular item in a gigantic whole to leverage and convince you to buy a certain thing. Division is then the opposite of that. If a whole big part has a certain property, um, the individual parts that make it up don't necessarily have that. Like a large house. If somebody has a large house, does that necessarily mean that each room is going to be large? And no, there might be a small room here or whatever. But the idea being that this whole big thing has this property, and therefore everything that's part of it will too. That's not necessarily true. Slippery slope. Slippery slope is basically like the fallacy that if we allow such and such a thing to happen, then another thing is sure to follow, and then usually there's a whole bunch of steps, and then finally some undesirable conclusion. The key that I look at when I'm listening to somebody argue the slippery slope is the first thing that they do is they go A therefore B, and then they go B therefore C, and then they go A therefore X. And that X is usually the undesirable conclusion. And what's missing are all those intermediate steps of going from C to D, D to E, E to F. And that, the idea being that they slipped down a slope that there's no returning from. Hasty conclusion. Basically then refers to presenting evidence that is relevant but insufficient to support the argument. A good example is time. When something happens after a certain other thing, does that necessarily mean that the first event caused the second one? And that's not necessarily true, A good example is, right now, like the deficit and things like that. Well, they go, well, because President Obama has been president, then he must be the reason why we are where we are today. And it's a lot more complicated than that, but because he's been here from this date to this date, then he must have caused this event. And that's false causality, and it isn't exactly true. There's only so much that can be done. Just because event B follows event A doesn't mean that A caused event B. But you would be led to believe this in certain political advertisements. 3, hasty generalization. This basically means playing with numbers. It means taking a non-representative sample and then portraying it as if it reflected an entire population. Here's a good example. If he did a survey of 10 students from his high school and 9 out of 10 of them said they disagreed with a policy, and then said that 90% of the students in the school disagreed with the policy, he would be lying. This would be a fallacy because he only interviewed 10. Now, if he had taken a survey that was representative of the entire school, or had surveyed the entire school, and they answered like, then he could say 90% of the students in the school disagree with the policy. That's what hasty generalization refers to. So these are all of the logical fallacies that I used to teach about in AP Lying and Composition. And we see them playing out every day. It's a matter of, are we smart enough to stop?